The sun leaned low above the village as laughter spilled beneath the giant baobab tree. Children ran barefoot over the red soil, their hands sticky with roasted groundnuts and sweetened yam cake. Smoke from simmering goat stew curled into the sky, mingling with the rhythmic throb of drums. It was the harvest festival, a time when the land was thanked and ancestors honored. The air buzzed with stories and song, with dancers dressed in reds, oranges and golds, each cloth brighter than the last. Women wore headscarves tall and regal, men clapped their hands in time with the beats, and the young drummers pounded the skins with practiced joy, each vibration echoing the spirit of celebration. Then she arrived. Ao stepped past the millet line near the entrance of the gathering ground, her sandals coated in dust, her eyes unflinching. She wore no color, only a deep brown wrapper and a blouse that had once been white, now dulled by time and water stains. No jewelry clinked from her wrists. No beads adorned her neck. Her head was uncovered, her hair braided simply, freshly oiled but plainly done. Her face held no expression, but her presence shifted the air like a sudden wind brushing past lit candles. One by one, dancers slowed their movements. Some stopped mid-step. The drums faltered for only a breath, but that breath was enough. Someone whispered her name. Someone else lowered their head. The drummers exchanged glances, unsure whether to continue. Then, unsure why, their hands softened on the skins. The rhythm broke apart into silence. The feast had not ended, but the festival, in spirit, paused. She did not speak. She only walked forward, each footstep echoing more loudly than the last beat of the gem. Her eyes moved across the crowd, not to search, but to let them know she had arrived. Elder Malika, who sat closest to the baobab, adjusted her shawl. She had known this moment would come. She just hadn't known it would come like this, with silence dragging behind Ao like a funeral cloth. The narrator, an older voice from the village, speaks quietly as if sharing a story the wind is not allowed to carry too loudly. The drums, the voice says, usually speak before the people do. They summon joy, welcome guests, announce births and warn of danger. They even beat when a couple marries, their rhythm blessing union. And sometimes they mourn. But never, not once in all these years, had the drums stopped because a woman simply walked in. It was not her feet that silenced them. It was her truth. Not yet spoken but felt. Not yet heard but feared. The children sat cross-legged. The older men, once laughing over palm wine, leaned into stillness. The women, sensing a storm that had long been coming, folded their arms tightly, clutching their chests as if to steady their own breathing. The silence was not empty. It was loud. The kind of silence that reminded the village that something sacred and dangerous was about to surface. Ao did not raise her hand. She did not bow. She stood before the baobab tree, whose roots stretched like thick fingers into the heart of the earth, and whose trunk had heard every secret this land had buried. She took one step closer. And just then the wind shifted, lifting dust into the air and pulling the edge of her wrapper to the side, revealing a single folded paper tucked at her waist. The baobab tree creaked in the breeze. Flashback begins. Ao had barely learned to wear her new name before the whispers of blessings filled the compound. She and Jelani had only been married for 3 seasons when the midwife noticed her slowing footsteps and her sudden nausea in the mornings. A wide smile had spread across the old woman's face that day, and before Ao could confirm it herself, the entire family was already dancing. Her mother-in-law broke a calabash of water against the stone at the compound's entrance, a sign of cleansing, renewal, and fertility. Her father-in-law, normally quiet and reserved, called the neighbors with loud claps and declared, "Our name will live on." Jelani stood tall that day, his hand resting lightly on Ao's back as though he had personally carved life into her womb. He was proud, and for a while that pride was soft and warm and protective. He spoke to her belly at night. He bought her groundnuts before she craved them. He carried her water pot without being asked. Their hut felt like the beginning of something good, something rooted and growing. Ao began learning from the elder midwives, especially Mama Ife, who had caught over 200 babies in her lifetime. "The womb is not just a room," Mama Ife said one evening under the mango tree. "It is a voice. It will tell you what it needs, but you must learn to listen." Ao listened. She learned how to bind herbs in cloth and where to place them on her back when it ached. She learned how to stretch slowly at dawn and sip bitter tea to strengthen the bones of her unborn child. She sang lullabies into the quiet of the morning, even though no child had yet arrived to hear them. In her heart she felt both joy and duty. Every evening neighbors came with gifts, plantains, beads, smoked fish. The women spoke of cravings and birth pains. The men nodded in approval as they talked of Jelani's strong seed. The village began to watch Ao not just as a wife, but as the vessel of a future. Her footsteps carried more meaning. Her smile became part of a bigger hope. But not all the joy came without weight. Whispers began inside the family compound, behind closed doors and veiled looks. Jelani's father was often overheard saying, "This child must be a son. He must not be weak like Ao's people." Jelani's older sister, who had once been warm, began to count the moons on her fingers as if keeping score. Even the gifts changed, no longer playful toys or blankets, but carved spears and small leather sandals meant for a boy. One night, Ao overheard her husband murmuring in the dark, "Our child will restore our name. He will not repeat the softness of the past." Ao said nothing. But inside her, a seed of worry took root. What if the child was a girl? What if her womb disappointed them? What if she could not carry the pregnancy to the end? She wrapped her arms around her belly as if to shield it from the weight of expectations. Her dreams began to change. The first dream came softly. She was walking through the forest, holding the hand of a child whose face she could not see. The wind whispered warnings in a language she couldn't understand. The next dream came sharper. She stood in a river of red water, the sky cracked with lightning, and Jelani stood on the shore, turning his back. In her waking hours she tried to brush it off. It's only fear, she told herself. Pregnancy plays games with the mind. But her body started to speak too. She began to feel faint in the mornings, not just sick but dizzy in a way that made the world tilt. Her legs cramped in the night. Her back ached constantly, and sometimes a sharp pain would shoot through her lower belly and vanish just as quickly. She didn't want to worry Jelani, so she mentioned it lightly. "It's nothing," she said with a half-laugh. "Maybe the child is just dancing too early." But his face tensed. "Don't talk like that," he said. "Our child must be strong. Don't bring weakness with your words." She said nothing more. She told Mama Ife, but even the midwife grew quiet. "Sometimes the womb carries both child and burden," she finally said. "Rest more. And speak less of your fears. Words shape reality." So Ao folded her fears and placed them in silence. She began to sleep sitting up, afraid of what lying flat would do. She avoided the river path alone, haunted by the images from her dreams. She chewed the herbs faithfully, rubbed the oils, sang the songs, but something in her spirit did not settle. Even her unborn child felt too quiet some days, too still. One afternoon, she sat beneath the shade of the guava tree and ran her hands over her belly, her heart tight with confusion. "I love you," she whispered. "But are you still here?" She waited for a kick. A flutter. A sign. The wind blew softly, but her womb remained silent. The night it happened, the sky was already uneasy. Clouds hung low over the hills like morning shawls, and the wind moved with restless force, sweeping through the compound and rattling the old millet bins. Ao had gone to bed early, her body aching more than usual. She felt heavy, not just in her belly but in her bones, in her breath. Jelani was away at a meeting with his uncles in the neighboring village. She lay alone on the mat, watching the oil lamp flicker on the mud wall, listening to the drip of rain begin on the thatch roof. Then came the pain. It started as a dull pressure, then a wave that rolled through her lower back and curled her body forward in agony. She gasped, reaching for the edge of the mat. Her palms were wet with sweat within moments. Another wave hit her, sharper this time, like something pulling from inside her, clawing to leave. She screamed. But the storm swallowed her voice. The younger wife of Jelani's cousin heard the cry and ran into the hut, her own wrapper barely tied. She took one look at the mat, now stained with dark blood, and bolted into the rain barefoot to fetch help. Within minutes, 3 women had gathered around Ao, lifting her trembling body onto a woven cot and covering her with cloths. No one asked questions. No one paused. They knew. The closest midwife was 2 hills away. The rain had turned the paths to mud. Still they carried her through it, barefoot, soaked, chanting soft prayers under their breath. Ao drifted in and out of consciousness. She felt her fingers dig into the cot, felt the slippery weight between her thighs, felt her lips move though no words came. When they reached Mama Tano, the elder midwife, Ao's body was cold, her eyes wide but unfocused. Mama Tano worked quickly. She pressed Ao's stomach, listened for movement, turned her head toward the rain as if asking the ancestors to make it not so. But her eyes dimmed. "The baby is gone," she said flatly. She bled too long. Ao didn't cry. She didn't speak. She only stared at the bamboo ceiling and let the truth settle like a stone on her chest. A life that had been growing inside her, moving, stretching, promising, was now still. The lullabies she had sung, the tiny sandals gifted by the aunties, the gourd of name-blessing water, it all meant nothing now. They brought her home at dawn. The rain had stopped, but the world felt hollow, as if the clouds had taken something with them when they passed. She was laid back on her mat, covered in fresh cloths, her feet washed with warm water and herbs. Women moved around her like shadows, clearing signs of blood, folding wrappers, pretending life was normal. Jelani arrived as the sun crept up. He entered the hut slowly. His face was unreadable, his jaw set like someone going to war. Ao, pale and weak, turned her eyes to him. He looked at her belly, then at her face. He said nothing for a long time. Then finally he spoke, not in a whisper, not in comfort, but with firmness. No one must know. Ao blinked, thinking she hadn't heard him clearly. He sat down beside her, his eyes sharp. We will say the child is recovering in the city. With my aunt. It's only for a while. She tried to sit up, but her body betrayed her. But, it's gone, she whispered, voice dry and broken. I know, he said. But they don't have to. She looked at him like he was someone she hadn't married. Why? He sighed deeply. It's better this way. My father is planning my place in the council. The village expects strength from us. If they hear the baby was lost, they'll start talking. About you. About your body. About weakness. Let's not give them fuel. She wanted to shout. To scream. But there was no air left in her lungs. Only ashes. That same evening the elders came by to offer blessings. Jelani met them at the doorway, a calm smile on his face. He welcomed them in, poured them cola and said, the child is recovering with my aunt in Ikiri. We wanted to keep him away from the village fever. The lie slid off his tongue like a practiced chant. The elders nodded in approval, clapped their hands and offered prayers for strong boys and future warriors. Inside Ao lay silent. She listened to each word through the mud wall. Her fingers clenched the edge of the mat. Her breasts ached from milk that would no longer be needed. Her womb felt like an abandoned drum, emptied of rhythm, void of voice. She did not speak. She could not. The room filled with laughter, with plans for naming ceremonies and carved gifts. Jelani spoke with ease. The elders praised him for thinking ahead and protecting the child. He accepted their admiration like it was his right. Like truth was too small a thing to honor when reputation was on the line. That night, Ao turned her back to him on the mat. She faced the wall, eyes open in the dark, the sounds of the village soft around her, owls calling, distant drums, children's sleepy giggles. She wept silently into her wrapper, careful not to make a sound. She had lost her child. But more than that, she had lost her voice. And no one, not even her husband, mourned it. The days that followed blurred together, stitched tightly with lies that Jelani wove like a skilled tailor. In the compound, no one wore mourning cloths. No songs of grief were sung. No elders poured libations to guide a spirit to the afterlife. Instead, life went on with the odd, unsettling cheer of a theater play. Jelani's family continued smiling at neighbors, their voices high and sure. His mother busied herself with planning a naming ceremony that would never come. His father boasted to visitors, our grandson will return soon, strong as an Irako. Jelani was at the center of it all, controlled, composed, charismatic. He repeated the story with careful consistency. The child had been taken by a maternal aunt to recover from a mild fever. A bit of weakness at birth, he'd say, rubbing the back of his neck in false concern. But nothing to worry about. He'll be home soon. He would shake hands firmly. Nod humbly. Smile when people complimented his foresight and modern thinking. But beneath that practiced charm was something colder. There had been whispers before, even before the pregnancy, of his use of enhancement herbs and secret fertility mixtures passed to him by a distant cousin who once trained in coastal healing practices. Some claimed those herbs were too strong. Some said they meddled with the spirit's natural order. Now, if the miscarriage became public, those whispers would grow into accusations. So Jelani decided. Silence would be his shield. He organized a naming ritual 3 weeks after the loss. The family courtyard was swept clean, and white cloth was hung from the trees. Friends were invited. Food was prepared. Music played low and ceremonial. A carved calabash was placed in the center of the gathering, wrapped in white cloth to represent the absent child. An elder stood over it, speaking prayers into the wind. No one questioned the child's absence, not openly. Fear and respect often walked hand in hand in that village. Ao sat silently during the ceremony, dressed in bright colors she hadn't chosen. Her face was powdered, her eyes painted to hide their hollowness. Her hands lay in her lap, cold and still. When the elder blessed the empty calabash, she turned her head away. When they sang the child's supposed name, Obinna, father's heart, she bit the inside of her cheek until it bled. Jelani placed his hand over hers for show. His grip was tight. That night, after the guests had gone and the lanterns had been put out, Ao sat alone by the hearth, unmoving. The silence in her womb echoed louder than any drum. She wanted to scream, to claw the truth into the walls. But each time she opened her mouth, shame and duty strangled the words. So instead she began to write. On pieces of old brown wrapping paper, torn from dried herb bundles, she scribbled letters to her unborn child. Sometimes they were long, filled with lullabies, apologies, hopes she could no longer speak aloud. Other times they were just a sentence or two. I felt you kicking the day before you left. Did you know I was singing for you? Forgive me. I didn't protect you. I didn't protect myself. You are still real to me, even if they pretend you never were. Each letter she folded tightly and slipped under the woven mat where she slept. Over time, a small bundle of grief grew beneath her, like hidden roots pressing against her spine. She feared what might happen if anyone found them. But she feared more what would happen to her soul if she didn't let the words out somehow. The web Jelani spun around them only grew thicker. He discouraged Ao from visiting the women's gathering spaces. You need rest, he'd say. No stress, not yet. He monitored her speech when guests came. He made decisions for both of them. He even corrected her in public when she hesitated while telling the story of the child's recovery. She became less a wife and more a character in the story he was scripting. People began to notice, but they said nothing. In a village where power commanded silence, few dared to disrupt the surface. Jelani's name was being considered for the youth council. His father had spoken to the chief. A man with that kind of trajectory could not afford a scandal, a shame, or a question mark. Ao lived among smiles and songs that felt like daggers. Her womb had emptied, but her soul stayed swollen with unshed sorrow. She often sat by the old drum behind the compound, the one that hadn't been played in years. She would rest her hand on it, gently, as if hoping to remember the heartbeat she once felt inside her. But all she heard was silence. And under that silence, lies. Layered, crafted, cherished by those who valued pride over truth. In the quiet corners of the village, behind cooking huts and in the shade of mango trees, there were women who knew the truth. They had been there on that stormy night, had touched Ao's trembling limbs, had seen the blood that soaked through the cloth. Elder Mama Tano, who had pronounced the baby gone. Sisi Kemi, the neighbor's wife, who helped carry Ao through the mud. Even Jelani's own aunt, Auntie Bose, had been told discreetly. But none of them spoke. Not because they lacked compassion, but because they lived in a place where truth had a cost, and that cost was often too heavy for a woman to carry alone. They watched as Jelani crafted his false tale, as the naming ceremony for an absent child unfolded like theater. Some bit their tongues until they bled. Others looked away, convincing themselves it was not their place. There were rumors, of course, murmurs behind water pots and inside grinding circles. Some said Ao's womb had betrayed her. Others hinted it was the herbs Jelani had taken that cursed the child. But no one confronted the truth openly. The drummer still beat for joy. The elders still blessed Jelani's name. The compound still welcomed guests who praised the strength of a baby who no longer existed. One afternoon, Auntie Bose, never known for holding her tongue, decided she couldn't bear it any longer. At the edge of the communal well, where women gathered to draw water and news, she said in a clear voice, "It is a shame we are dancing for a shadow. The child is gone. We should be mourning with her." The silence that followed was deep and dangerous. Someone gasped. Another woman coughed nervously. A few glanced around, hoping no elder or man had heard. But someone had. Within hours, the news reached Jelani's father. By nightfall, Bose was summoned and scolded. She was told to stay out of matters, too heavy for a woman's tongue. The next morning, her husband forbade her from speaking to Ao again. She was humiliated at the market, mocked with whispers, "Jealous auntie," they called her, trying to bring shame to her own blood. After that, no one else dared to speak aloud. But something began to shift. Ao noticed the way certain women looked at her, long, steady glances that carried unspoken apologies. When she passed, some would lower their gaze not in shame but in shared knowing. She began receiving small bundles of herbs wrapped in palm leaves, fertility roots, calming leaves, healing teas, tucked quietly into her basket while she was not looking. One day, Mama Tano passed her in the narrow footpath and pressed a boiled egg into her hand without a word. The egg was warm, salted with tears not yet shed. Ao took it and said nothing, but her eyes filled. This was not friendship. It was grief, passed woman to woman. Not the loud kind. The quiet kind. The kind that braided itself into daily life, into silence, into the way a pot was stirred slower than usual or a song hummed in a lower key. A silent sisterhood began to form, not of rebellion but of remembrance. Women who'd lost children. Women who had never carried at all. Women who knew what it meant to grieve in corners. They met each other in the spaces between speech. One brought Ao a cloth dyed black and deep blue, the colors of mourning, folded beneath bright wrappers. Another left a wooden figurine of a child at the foot of her door one dawn. No note, no signature. Just presence. Just pain carved carefully into wood. Ao began to understand. This was bigger than her. It wasn't just about her child. It was about a culture that wrapped men in reputation and women in silence. About how a woman's pain was too often made invisible, unless it could be wrapped in a celebration, a birth, a wedding, a legacy. But not in loss. She realized then that what had died was not only her child. There had been a second burial, the truth. And now, as these quiet offerings came to her like funeral ashes scattered gently, she felt the weight of a third burial taking place, one deeper still. Her voice. Her voice was being buried too. Not by force but by expectation. By shame. By the way people nodded kindly while keeping her wound wrapped in silence. She began to light small candles by the riverbank in the evenings. She said nothing when people passed by. But the light drew others. Slowly a few women joined her. Not to talk. Just to sit. To breathe. To remember. Ao didn't know what it meant yet or what it could become. But she knew this. Grief unspoken doesn't disappear. It roots itself in the soil. And someday it will grow wild. The festival grounds were alive with color, voices, and layered perfumes of roasted maize, smoked tilapia, and shea butter. The village dance that year was not just a celebration of harvest. It had been reshaped into a ceremony of honor, meant to recognize the contributions of young men rising to the ranks of leadership. Jelani's name was on every elder's lips. His father, already seated beside the chief under the decorated canopy, beamed with pride. Ao had begged not to attend. She had pleaded quietly in the early hours of that morning, while folding the headscarf she didn't want to wear. "I am not well," she said. Jelani looked at her through the mirror, where he adjusted the folds of his agbada. "They'll notice if you're absent. A leader's wife doesn't go missing during a celebration meant for him." His tone left no room for refusal. So she wrapped the scarf, painted her lips, wore the wrapper she hadn't touched since the fake naming ceremony. She arrived with him, side by side, like a figure carved from wood beside a man made of wind and noise. Children darted through the crowds. Drummers lined the outer ring of the gathering ground, beating rhythms that lifted skirts and moved feet. The women clapped. The elders nodded along. Men in line for recognition were seated on raised stools, each waiting to be praised by the talking drummer. Jelani sat among them, eyes forward, mouth tight with pride. Ao sat in the wives section, surrounded by faces that had watched her for moons in silence. Some smiled politely. Some looked away. Her hands lay still in her lap. Her mind pulsed with a rhythm her heart couldn't quiet. Then the drumming changed. The djem player shifted tempo. The balafon picked up a bright, fluttering melody that made the crowd cheer. A second drummer added the beat reserved for childbirth blessings, the rhythm used when celebrating first sons, when welcoming newborns into the arms of community. The women looked at her. Some confused. Some knowingly. The lead griot stepped forward with his carved staff and raised his voice, "To the one whose womb carried legacy, to the mother of our future, Ao, wife of Jelani, today we sing for you." The crowd erupted in applause. Ao felt her throat tighten. She hadn't expected this. A performance. A reinforcement of the lie. They were honoring a child who had never drawn breath, exalting a man who had buried the truth with his own hands. She looked over at Jelani. He was clapping, smiling, accepting the praise. The drums grew louder. The women began to rise and sway. Ao stood too. Not to dance, but to walk. She stepped forward without a word. Each footfall on the red earth struck harder than the one before. One by one the drummers faltered. The balafon stuttered. Movement slowed. Eyes turned. The rhythm broke. She walked to the center of the square, bareheaded now, her scarf falling to her shoulders. Silence. Even the children stopped. Even the chief straightened in his seat. She turned slowly in a full circle, letting her eyes pass over the crowd. Her voice came, not loud at first, but low and steady. The drums beat for a lie. A gasp rippled through the circle. She stepped closer to the elders, her voice growing. You clap for a child who is not alive. You sing for a womb that is empty. You honor a man who built a crown from my silence. Jelani started to rise, but the chief raised his hand, ordering stillness. Ao's voice rose again. The child you celebrate died. On a night when the sky cracked and my body failed me. There was no ceremony. No mourning. Just herbs, blood, and silence. The same silence you all handed me like a second skin. No one moved. The drummers lowered their heads. The truth, she said, turning to the women now, was buried. Not with tears but with pressure. With duty. With fear. Her voice broke once, but she caught it like a woman catching her own fall. I grieved alone. I was told to lie. I was told to wear colors when I needed to wear black. I was asked to celebrate while my heart begged to scream. Now her hands rose, not in performance but as if releasing something. I will not pretend anymore. The wind picked up. Dust lifted gently from the ground. I did carry life, she said. And I lost it. That does not make me broken. It makes me human. And I will not let anyone rewrite my pain. Jelani's face had hardened. His father looked like a stone. But the women, they were watching her now with something new. Not pity. Not fear. Recognition. Ao stepped back slowly. The square was still silent. Even the leaves on the baobab tree seemed to wait. No one clapped. No one spoke. And yet, something enormous had just happened. She had taken the stage meant to honor a myth, and laid the truth bare like an open wound under the sun. Her voice had risen above the drums. And in that silence, a different rhythm began. At first there was only silence. The kind of silence that pressed down like a heavy stone. No wind. No coughs. No clapping hands to rescue the tension in the air. The drums that once beat to honor her now lay still, their stretched hides trembling in the windless square. Ao stood at the center like a flame that refused to flicker. And then, as if someone had finally dared to exhale, the first wave of reaction rolled through the crowd. The elders, especially the older men, shifted, murmuring under their breaths. One councilman shook his head and muttered, "Disgraceful, a wife with no shame." Another slapped his palm against his thigh and barked, "This is not how things are done. She should have gone to her husband. Not here." The chief's eyes did not blink. His fingers drummed silently against his knee. His silence was unreadable. Jelani, still seated among the honored men, looked like a man watching a roof collapse slowly over his own head. He tried to rise but his legs were slow. When he finally stood, he didn't speak immediately. His hands fluttered in front of him, unsure what gesture to make. She misunderstood. The ceremony was not. He stammered, looking to his father, then to the chief, then to the stunned crowd. He was unraveling. It was to protect her dignity, he finally said, loud enough for some to hear. It was private. A miscarriage is not a parade. But no one applauded his reasoning. Not this time. Some of the women, particularly the older ones, bowed their heads. Some even turned away, uncomfortable, unwilling to pick sides. But the younger women, their eyes burned. They stood a little straighter. Their lips curled into subtle, dangerous smiles. A few glanced at each other with a new light in their gaze. One girl whispered under her breath, "She said it." She actually said it. And from the far edge of the crowd, a slow, deliberate clap rose from one of the widows, a former midwife who had long stopped being invited to ceremonies like this. The clap didn't last long and no one joined her. But it sounded like truth tapping on a sealed door. Later that afternoon, as the crowd dispersed, Ao returned to Jelani's compound. Her steps were calm, but the air around her was electric. She packed slowly, folding each cloth not with anger but with clarity. She took the dried herbs she had hidden beneath her bedding, the letters she had written to her unborn child, and the small stool she always sat on near the fire, worn smooth by months of silent grief. Jelani stood at the entrance, fuming. "You've shamed me," he said. "Do you think they will make me councilman now? Do you even care?" She did not answer. The elders had already sent a messenger earlier. She was to leave the compound, until further reflection could be made. No one used the word exile. But everyone knew what it was. She tied her wrapper firmly around her waist and lifted the basket to her head. "You think I'm leaving in shame," she said softly. "But I'm walking in truth." Then she walked out, barefoot on the red dust path, her back straight like a mast in a storm. By nightfall, she had reached her late aunt's abandoned hut at the edge of the village, beside the shea grove. It was quiet there. Empty. But not unfamiliar. She swept it clean. Spread her mat. lit a small oil lamp. Then she waited. And slowly they began to come. The first was the old midwife who had clapped. She brought herbs. Nothing was said. She simply laid the bundle at the doorway and turned to go. Then a girl from the weaver's compound came, barely 15, but with eyes that had already seen too much. She brought roasted plantains and left them without a word. The next day another woman came. This one brought nothing but tears. She wept on Ao's floor for a child she had lost 10 harvests ago, and had never told anyone about. In the days that followed, Ao's small hut became a gathering place, not loud, not defiant, but steady. They didn't come to fight. They came to feel what had been denied, the right to grieve, to speak, to exist without explanation. Back in the main village, whispers began to shift. The chief summoned Jelani for a private audience. Elders debated whether Ao had gone too far, or whether the community had failed her. Some still believed she had disgraced herself. But others, especially the younger women, started refusing to perform the same silences their mothers had carried. They began asking questions. Why are we only ever called brave when we keep quiet? Why are our wombs only honored when they produce sons? What of the women who carry sorrow and survive? Ao did not answer those questions. She just swept the ground outside her hut each morning, cooked enough to share, wrote more letters to her child and buried them near the shea roots. And when the drummers passed by her grove one afternoon, on their way to another ceremony, they paused briefly. One of them looked toward her hut and beat a single, solemn rhythm. Not for a child, but for a woman who chose truth over tradition, and walked through fire without letting it turn her to ash. It began with whispers, then footsteps on soft earth, then the quiet, intentional planting of grief where it had once been forbidden. Ao did not intend to start a revolution. She was simply surviving. In the mornings she swept the space outside her aunt's old hut. In the afternoons she sat under the shade tree, writing letters to her unborn child in a worn leather journal, her handwriting more steady now. Sometimes she hummed old lullabies, not out of delusion but out of defiance. The songs were hers to sing, even if no child would ever respond. Word spread quietly, faster than gossip, softer than thunder. The women came not in crowds but in twos and threes. At first they said little. They came with cracked voices and tear-bruised eyes. Ao didn't ask them to speak. She offered Matt space, a little broth and a listening silence. And soon the space began to shape itself. She called it the grief hut. It had once been used for old tools and drying herbs. Now it smelled of lemongrass and frankincense. Inside were mats, journals made from old cloth and dried leaves, carved sticks used to press symbols into the earth, and a simple pot of shea oil for rubbing sore feet after long emotional weeping. No drums. No speeches. Just the sound of women remembering that their pain was real. One afternoon the elder midwife, once pushed to the edges of village life, came walking up the path. Her back was no longer straight, but her presence was unmistakable. She said nothing as she approached Ao's door. In her hand was a small, carved stone, a flat piece of river rock, with the etching of a closed eye and an open palm. She placed it at the door. Then nodded once, turned and left. It was an old sign. Older than most remembered. A mark used by women generations ago, when words were forbidden and silence was weaponized. The stone meant, I see you. I stand with you. Even if I cannot speak. That evening, Ao wept harder than she had in weeks. But this time the tears tasted like power. Days turned to weeks, and what had once been private grief became a kind of sacred rite. Women began to speak in their own homes, not just about miscarriages, but about the burdens they had carried in silence. Stillbirths, painful monthly bleeds, the endless pressure to produce sons, and the shame of not bleeding properly after weddings. Ao didn't counsel them like a priestess. She simply gave them tools. Write what you never said. Bury it, or burn it, or wear it in a locket around your neck. But don't carry it in your bones anymore. Some women wrote letters. Others made marks in clay. One woman painted her belly with charcoal and danced until she collapsed from release. Men scoffed at first. Womb watchers, they sneered. What's next? Crying circles? But even their wives stopped laughing at those jokes. Then something happened that nobody expected. Jelani's sister, Muna, a tall, sharp-eyed woman with status and position, came to the grief hut with her head uncovered. She had always been among the proud ones, never soft, never silent. But she entered the hut, sat beside Ao and after a long pause whispered, My second baby died in the womb. I was told not to name it. I named her anyway. Her name was Amina. Ao reached for her hand. I'm sorry you had to name her in silence, she said. Muna exhaled. Not anymore. Thank you, Ao, for teaching us how to name what they told us to bury. By dusk, the whole village knew that Muna had gone to the grief hut. And the whispers changed. What had once been dismissed as women's softness began to be regarded as something else, something ancestral, something that had the power to remake a village's soul. Even those who didn't understand it could not deny it anymore. The grief hut was no longer just a place for tears, it had become a place of rebirth. Young wives began walking differently, less hunched under shame. The midwives carried their herbs with renewed dignity. Even the drummers passed by with a certain reverence, tapping their rhythms slower when near the shea grove, as if unsure whether their hands deserved to echo in a space now known for sacred truths. Ao still lived simply. She cooked her own meals, fetched her own water, and slept on the same mat. But now, she did so with the knowledge that her story had become a bridge, for others to walk across their pain and find healing. And when new women came and asked what the hut was for, she never said, "It's mine." She said, "It's yours. It's ours. It's the place where we stop hiding our wounds and start naming what they told us to forget." The council seat remained empty that season. Where Jelani's name was once spoken with pride, there was now a silence too dense to ignore. Elders mumbled excuses. He is still young. He simply misunderstood what was proper, but the truth rang louder than their mutterings. Too many had heard Ao's voice that night. Too many had seen her stand beneath the moonlight, unshaken, while the drums fell silent. And too many knew, Jelani hadn't just lied. He had stolen a truth that wasn't his to silence. The final blow came at the river assembly. Each year, the appointed councilmen brought offerings before the river stone, declaring their pledges before the community. Jelani, in a robe he hadn't earned, approached the stone, but the elder midwife stood in his path. She did not raise her voice. She simply said, "This is not yours to carry," and turned her back. One by one the women followed. Some walked away from the assembly altogether. Others stood behind her in a line of quiet protest. Even Muna, his sister, refused to sit in the family space. She crossed her arms and looked toward the sky as if saying, "This time, the heavens must judge for themselves." The elders had no choice. Jelani's name was struck from the appointment scroll. His face, once carved into the outer wall of the council hut in soft clay, was quietly erased. Just like that, the clay cracked and fell as if the wall itself had waited for truth. In the days that followed, Jelani did not shout or protest. He stayed indoors, away from the markets and the main square. But eventually he came to Ao. She was watering the herbs outside the grief hut when she saw his shadow. He didn't speak at first, just stood there, his once proud shoulders now folded in on themselves. "I was afraid," he finally said. "Afraid they would say I failed as a man, that I failed as a husband." Ao kept her gaze on the soil. "You did fail," she said calmly. "But not at being a man. You failed at being honest." He swallowed hard. "I thought if I kept the story neat, if I protected the image, we could move past it." Ao stood. "Do you know what that lie cost?" she asked. "It didn't just hide pain. It multiplied it. It taught every man here that women's bodies are tools for reputation. And it taught every girl that silence is safety." Jelani lowered his eyes. "I want to make it right." She stepped forward, not with anger but with unwavering stillness. "This is not your redemption story, Jelani. It's mine." And with that she turned back to the herbs. He didn't follow. That evening the drums returned to the village square. But they beat differently now. No longer reserved for childbirth or council honors, the rhythms had changed. Ao herself had spoken to the drummers, and together they created something new, a beat called Okulu, which meant to rise after breaking. The first Okulu ceremony was held under the moon. Young girls danced barefoot, each holding a small item representing their mother's or sister's stories, a bracelet, a cloth stained with tears, a journal page. They danced not to praise fertility but to honor truth. Ao sat among the crowd, not at the front, not on a throne but on the ground with the rest of the women. She clapped along as a girl named Sepha sang a chant she had written herself. "They told me not to say it. But I stitched my truth into the hem of my skirt. Now when I walk, even the earth hears me coming." Even some of the elders stayed. And while not all understood, none dared interrupt. The grief hut became a second home to many. One woman, recently married, brought a pot of white paint and carefully inscribed the word Maisha, life born from loss, above the door. Ao didn't stop to celebrate the changes. She knew the village had a long way to go. There were still whispers, still tension, Still some who said she had shamed tradition. But for every whisper a girl now sang. For every critic, a woman came forward with her story. And for every time the drums once covered lies, they now uncovered truth. Jelani remained in the village. He took to helping with communal farming, and over time even he began to change, not because he was forgiven instantly but because he finally learned how to listen. But Ao never went back to being his wife. She had outgrown the space he had built with fear and falsehood. Now she walked freely, no longer haunted by the silence. And the village, slowly, painfully, began to bend toward something better. Not perfect, but better. Because the beat of truth is never perfect. It stumbles, it trembles, it pauses for breath. But it never lies. The river ran slow that morning, curling like a ribbon through the softened earth. Ao sat beneath the baobab tree, her feet cool against the sand. In her lap, a small child slept. Her daughter, wrapped in cloth dyed with indigo and marula flower, heart steady as a drum's hush before it roars. There was no celebration today. No guest, no chant, no feast. And yet, it felt more sacred than any wedding or naming ceremony. Ao reached into her basket and pulled out a faded journal, the one she had begun in silence, long before the village ever knew how deeply a woman could break and still rebuild. She opened a page worn at the edges, ink blotted with age and rain. She read aloud. I am not made of secrets. I am made of storms and stillness. Of wombs that empty and hearts that refill. Of drums that once lied for me and now speak my name with every beat. The baby stirred, curling tiny fingers around a loose thread on Ao's wrapper. A bird overhead tilted its head as if listening. Then across the clearing the drummers began. No one had summoned them. No baby had been born that day. No couple wed. And yet, the drums answered her words like an old friend. Not loud, but sure. Boom, pa boom, pa boom, pa. Ao smiled. The rhythm wasn't just music now. It was memory. It was legacy. It was the shape of her truth carved into sound. Years ago they beat for lies. Now they listened. Children from the village peeked from behind tall grass. Women who once whispered now stood tall, letting tears gather without shame. The grief hut still stood behind the hill, now filled with letters, songs, and tokens. Stones from miscarried prayers, herbs from midwives' secrets, drawings from daughters born after silence. And whenever the wind shifted just right, it carried whispers from its walls. She made the drums listen. That's what the village said now. When a girl came forward with trembling hands, the elders no longer hushed her. They paused. When a man sought to cover pain with pride, there was always a grandmother to say, even Jelani learned. So can you. And when women sat in circles after dusk, they didn't just weave or peel cassava. They told stories, of loss, of voice, of truth. And always, Ao's name found its way into the firelight. She kissed her daughter's forehead and leaned back into the tree, the sky open above her, the river still moving forward. She had spoken. And the wind had carried her truth. Not just through the leaves but through a people. Through generations. Through drums that would never lie again. They told her to be quiet. To let her silence be the price for his honor. To hold her breath while they rewrote her story in whispers and rituals she did not choose. They told her to wear white, to smile gently, to bow her head when the elders came. Even when her womb had cried out in the night. Even when the child she carried had returned to the stars. Even when her arms were left empty and aching. But she did not weep where no one could hear. She did not bury her pain in the corners of their shame. She waited. She breathed. She let the ache live inside her chest like a second heartbeat. They told her, it's not your place. They told her, grief belongs in the kitchen. They told her, if you love him, protect his name. But love, real love, does not ask you to go silent. It does not fold your truth into corners. It does not call your pain an inconvenience. She stood in the square they once made her walk through as a bride. She stood where the drums had lied. Where the dancers twirled around a fiction. Where the air still smelled of smoke from the naming fire they lit for a child who never opened her eyes. She stood, and she opened her mouth. She did not whisper. She did not stammer. She did not shake. Her words poured like rain onto a thirsty field. They cracked the masks of those who watched. They splintered the wooden frame of old customs. Not to break the village, but to wake it. She said the truth. She said her truth. And the drums, those mighty ancient voices, fell silent. Not out of protest, but out of reverence. She did not curse him. She did not spit his name into the dirt. She simply unwrapped the silence and held it up to the light. And that was enough. More than enough. Because grief, when spoken, becomes something holy, something brave, something that teaches. She wrote letters to her unborn child with hands still trembling. She placed them under the mat, thinking they would be forgotten. But the wind remembered. The tree beside the river remembered. And one day the village remembered too. Now, in that same village, the one that once forced her to smile with an empty belly, girls are told, let your voice carry. Let it rise above the huts, the drums, the stairs. Let it shake the ground if it must. Because your truth is not a storm to be hidden. It is the soil that softens others. It is the fire that makes new drums. It is the river that brings back the missing. She taught them how to grieve without apology, how to remember without permission, how to name a pain that others tried to hide. And in doing so, she didn't just reclaim her story, she rewrote the village's memory. Now when the drums begin, it is not only for births or weddings. It is for courage. It is for truth. It is for every woman who once sat in silence and now rises to speak. The grief hut still stands, not as a place of mourning, but of meeting, of making, of mending. Her daughter will grow knowing. Her mother made the drums listen. Her mother made the wind sing her name. Her mother taught the village what healing sounds like. And when that girl someday finds herself carrying joy or loss or rage or tenderness, she will not be told to hush. She will be handed a drum. And the village will listen. Because of one woman, who spoke when it was forbidden, who bled and still built, who mourned and still moved, who loved deeply but never again at the cost of her voice. They once asked her to dance while her heart was breaking. Now they dance because she broke open the silence. And the rhythm that follows her story is not one of sorrow. It is the rhythm of truth finally unshackled. It is the rhythm of a village beginning again. So remember her. Not for the child she lost, but for the voice she found. Not for the drums that lied, but for the silence she shattered. She did not raise her voice to punish. She raised it to plant. And what she planted was a forest of women who will never again be asked to bury their stories. They will speak, and the wind will not hush them. They will stand, and the drums will not drown them. They will carry the truth like a birthright. And every time their voices rise, we will know, she made the drums listen.